Hey, I'm Chris Gilchrist. I get to serve as the executive pastor here at Stonebridge Church in the Woodlands. Welcome to Sunday Continued. This is where we keep the conversation going after Sunday, asking the questions we didn't get to, talking through what this actually looks like in real life, and figuring out how to live it out during the week. If you're new to Stonebridge or just exploring, we're so glad that you're here. Our heart is simple. It's to lead people to a real, healthy, and growing relationship with Jesus Christ. And if you're local to the Woodlands or Magnolia, we'd love to meet you sometime. We gather every Sunday at 9:30 and 11:05. Now let's dive in. So this past week, we were in Acts 13, and you kind of had this disclaimer of, hey, you might be getting tired of Paul's missionary journey, which I thought was an interesting way.
No, we just started.
So. Well, I know, but you gave everyone the freedom to admit that Acts can sometimes feel repetitive.
Yes, and I don't know why, but for some reason, because it is such an important time in the expansion of the church, but it just always, I don't know, Paul's first missionary journey, then Paul's second missionary journey, then Paul's third missionary journey. I'm like, okay, you know.
Well, it doesn't give me a lot of hope when you're like Mr. Geography and you care about all the cities and being detailed. I'm like, if anyone should be excited about this, it's Steve, because he gets to use a map on stage.
And I even got in trouble because even my son said, Dad, there are two Antiochs. I said, I know, I mentioned that.
You did, yeah.
But he wanted to make it that it was confusing. So
well, but I do think it is, like, for a reader, when you read that and you don't have the map with you, I do think it's really easy to be like, okay, so he went back to Antioch again, and not realizing that those are two completely different cities. And so, but I think the main thing that you actually talked about in Acts 13 was this concept of leadership, and what does it look like to be a leader in the midst of all this change that's happening in the church. And so for you, Steve, like, when you think about just being a leader, like, what do you think of? Like, what defines a leader in your mind? You didn't talk about that on Sunday, but I'm going to make you talk about it.
And that's that can be a really good thing. I mean, I think that it's easy to come up with leadership traits and say this is what a leader looks like. And it's one of the reasons that I like Bonham's book, because he doesn't do that, and he makes that comment, about that it's really about people, not about strategies, it is about strategies, and it is about places, and it is, but it really is about people. And so what works with people changes. Yeah. Because the people change and the culture changes. For us, the culture changes much faster than it did for them. But again, they are a place in the world, a culture of people that is going through enormous changes, because the world has changed with these new empires that take over and rule and determine and say, here's your new language and here's your new, and it just takes a lot longer for those things then. And for us, it's faster,
When you have even these moments, too, of like you have all these empires taking over, but then you also have this new religion that's starting to take over, too, and starting to invade the Jewish culture. And even still, you begin even in, I think, Acts 13, seeing the approach that they have. They go to the synagogue first, and they proclaim it to the Jews, and then they start realizing that they're less receptive than even the Gentiles. And so you even see Paul and Barnabas's leadership, even and how they approach things, and their strategy, kind of to your point, begins to change based on the culture that they're entering into.
And I think, even with that, to have the combination, which we didn't talk about, of Paul and Barnabas, is such an important and unique combination of the two guys that, in that sense, spearhead it more than anybody else. And in one sense, very different. But because Barnabas was so strategic with Paul and his growth, which by this point, and that's one of the things that's hard when you're reading it to understand now, they're probably 15 years, maybe even more.
It seems as if it's still within the like when you read it without the knowledge, it seems like it's 60 days later.
Yes. Yeah. But they've gone through changes, and Paul has had all of this time, which I do love, to put it together in his own head because of his own understanding of the Jewish law and being a Pharisee. He's put it together so that he can just kind of roll through this in such a natural way, and be an influence in this way, and an influencer that is very different than the way influencers worked before this.
Oh, yeah.
So Peter was different. Peter's a lot more aggressive with the Jewish his Jewish brothers and sisters. Paul is much more I don't know if lenient's the word, but it's much more understanding and trying to help them move forward. But at the end of the narrative there in chapter 13, he's going to say,
No, I still disagree. I mean, he dusts his feet off, which was, their tradition of saying, hey, you've rejected truth, and he kind of moves on past it.
Time for me to move on.
It is interesting, though, of just the differences between Peter and Paul, because you do one see their leadership differences. And I like your point, because I do think because of the letters, we think of Paul as like this passionate, more dogmatic, more aggressive towards the Jewish people.
Right.
And then when you actually see in Acts the differences between him and Peter, I would agree with you that I think that it is a less aggressive stance than you see from Peter's response.
And it's one of the complaints that later are criticisms of Paul is that in his letters he is weighty, but in person they would view him as, no, you weren't tough on them at all. And this is not one of his letters. This is where Luke is writing what he said, and you see a real compassion for the Jewish people, and he's trying to urge them forward and lead them, in a direction, but doesn't work. But still,
I think it's also just one of the differences of when he's first going to those people. It's the first time he's introducing Jesus to them, and then in the letters, he's talking to churches that have been established and correcting them and trying to help fix the mistakes. And I think, even that's some of the recognizing of like how should we as approach people when we first meet them, when they are far from Christ, and then when he's addressing them when they...
And I think that happens a lot, which is why I said, if on something, if I'm here and I'm speaking to you guys as a church, I may say it a certain way. If I'm out there and I'm dealing with somebody I work with, in my job or maybe at school or whatever, you're not going to approach it the same way, and you shouldn't, because they don't have the same background or understanding. You still have to start with who they are and where they are, and then work from there, because you are trying to persuade them. You are trying to, now you're looking to God and to the Holy Spirit to move a person's heart, but you're still part of that process, and it is important of how you do it. So
when like you said, Peter's approach was more aggressive because he's talking to these Jewish people in Jerusalem, the context they understand. Then you see Paul in this setting, but we'll see in other settings as well, of how he changes his approach to speak to different people in different cultures.
Right.
And so in your mind, Steve, what are some ways that we get it wrong and the ways that we try to approach culture and when we're trying to tell people about Jesus? What are some of the natural things that we maybe do to speak to our culture that I'm like, that doesn't quite work to the same degree?
And I guess I would say the only way I can answer there is try to look back and say, what are the ways that I have gotten it wrong in the past?
Sometimes it's a helpful,
But that's the reality of it, is you learn from your mistakes, or you hope that you do. And I would say that I would say that sometimes I have approached it as if they know things that they really don't know, or they have a conviction that they do not have, or and so if you play by those rules, it may work in my head really well, but it might not work with the other person really well. And so a lot of that is why you listen and you try to relate, and I've always actually enjoyed that part, because I like the stopping and let's reason this out, let's think about this, but you want to hear what they say. Also, I had a good friend that would always say, if you had it your way, on Sunday you would have response from everybody in the room. Also, I said, oh man, that would be, if you could get a response. Because if you don't know what somebody's thinking or how they hear what you just, because it really is true. It's not what you say, it's what do they hear.
Yeah.
And what they hear has a lot to do with who they are, their life, how they see it, what their principles or foundations are. And you are trying to, as Paul says, I am trying to persuade them. Sometimes people will make statements, and I do understand, like, well, we're not here to indoctrinate. Well, On Sunday,
There's-
we are. That
there's
is
an
what we're
essence of
actually
that, yeah.
doing. When
We're
you
trying to
teach,
convince people of things,
when you're trying to teach, that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
So
Well, and I just even think for the times that I've gotten it wrong, it is, I think, a lot of times when I just assume things about their story or I assume things
Right.
about their culture or think that they, like you said, they grew up in the Bible Belt like I did, and so they have this, Christ background. And I think, we sometimes we jump the gun of we don't learn about people first, and we just want to tell them what they want to hear. And I think, when we can flip that, when we can learn about people and understand their culture and their background and the things that they're bringing into the story of Jesus, whether they're right or wrong,
right.
the better chance that we're going to have to speak to their context. And
Yeah, and I read an article, gosh, it was a long time ago, where a guy was talking about leadership, and he said that, from his view, leaders are really made for conflict and change and wars and whatever, whether you're going back to, history or whatever. And leaders aren't really made for the in-between times. He would say those are managers. So what I would say is, but it's two different things. So if you're a leader, you have to respond to what's going on. And so that will demand a different direction or different words or different strategy than when you're at a time where things are going well and you're trying to help move forward. So there's not really any conflict or struggle, even though there is, but it's not the same type
it's not
of
war
thing.
magnitude.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's, for me, I would say that's a big part of being a leader, that people tend to pick a leader as either a General Patton, and that's what only kind of leader there is, and who did really well in conflict and war. I love it when, I think it was during World War II, the president, he'd gotten canned for things that he had done. And I think it was the Battle of the Bulge or something like that, where they brought Patton back because they knew they had to have somebody that knew this is the goal, and no matter what, they're going to get there. And so he was that kind of personality. He wasn't good when it wasn't like that. He liked the conflict better. And sometimes that's what people think of as a leader. That's not always true, and that's why I say what I love about this part of Acts is that there are new leaders popping up. They're doing different things than were done before because, in one sense, God always has planned for you to be a leader in something. He's either preparing you or using you in something. It may not be what you were planning on, but he has a place for you.
Well, you even talked about, how your leadership changed just even in your development and having a family, right? Your leadership started with just you as an individual, and you still do need to lead yourself. Like, you need to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to do. But then you kind of talked about this, projection of you married Joni, then you had Jamie and Jordan, and just every one of those steps, your leadership in your family changed.
Yeah.
And I think even like what you're saying, that those are moments where your leadership is still going to be necessary because you do need to lead your family, and you need to step up and change, and you can't just run off with a gym bag and go play basketball whenever you want to, even though you tried at one point.
I did. I tried, and I got called out on it, and it was a good called out that, it doesn't work that way anymore.
Well, it's good to have a wife,
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And I remember when I was in college reading an article. It was either by Rod Sargent or Lawrence Sandy, who had just taken over the leadership of the Navigator ministry, and they talked about it. I couldn't wait to be the leader, and now I don't have to answer anybody. And then they said it ended up being the opposite. Now I answer to everybody, and it doesn't mean that you answer to everybody. It means you take on more responsibility when you move up. And the question is, are you really ready for that? Do you want to do that? And it's not going to be easier. It doesn't mean, oh, good, I can just do whatever I want to do. It means you have to think of, just like you said, with kids coming along. I have to think about those kids, and the heart that is there is probably easier with your own kids than in larger groups where you don't know everybody.
Sure.
And but understand, but that is your job. That is your responsibility.
What was the leadership jump from you from doing, single adults in Houston down at Second to coming to Woodlands Parkway Baptist, what is now Stonebridge? Like, what was that like, and what were the difficulties of that? And did you feel that shift of feeling like, oh, now I can do what I want to do, but there's some stuff that comes along with it?
Yeah. And I would say that during that shift, it was the thing that we talked about at the very end of the service, is you do have to build it on truth and trust. And because without trust, you're not a leader. You won't lead because no one will follow you, and if they find out what you're telling them or teaching them or trying to lead them to is not true, if they don't think it's worth pursuing, they're not going to follow you. And so you've lost it, there also. And you've got to go beyond just what's on the surface, just what you see, what a person is like, and you have to see the issues that are deeper and that are there, and then you have to take them to the next step, and that's different in every situation. What is the next step? And sometimes you'll have to go learn the next step yourself. And
How hard of a transition was that for you to go from what you were doing before to down here? Was it what you expected, or was it harder? Or
it wasn't what I expected.
What was different about it?
Yeah. In that case, coming from a large church down in Houston, it was, I had my role, but honestly, it still ultimately was on the shoulders of the pastor that I worked for. Now, all of a sudden, there was nobody like that.
It was you.
Well, it's really him. Yeah, that's right. It stops here. And that's one of the things that happens when all of a sudden, like I said, you get married. Now there's nobody, mom and dad, to turn to and say, it's on you, and kids, well, it's on you. And and so you have to be concerned about, am I leading correctly? Am I helping them? I don't know all the answers, but am I doing a good job? And about the time you figure it out, it's time to move on to something else. But that's okay,
I think one of the things that maybe people don't realize about your job in particular is just what it feels like for a large group of people to entrust their spiritual development to you in a lot of ways, and to lead and to guide, and the pressure that comes with that. I think, it's easy to be like, well, Steve's main job is to talk on Sunday, which is a major part of your job.
I've had people before ask me, what do you do during the week? Because I'll tell them, I remember I was in another country and they asked me what I did, and I told them. They said, okay, but what about during the week? And I said, well, no, that is my job even during the week. Yeah, but I mean, what do you do during the week? I know on Sunday, they didn't ever understand. And I was like, okay, I don't know how to explain it.
No, yeah, I think it's different. And I just think, the leadership that it takes to lead a congregation and to go through the trials that, that we have gone through at various times, I think, and that is hard at times. And I think it's not as glamorous as that it might seem on the surface to work with people to that degree and to.
But as most people know, it is that way, but it's always rewarding when you get to work with people, because I do think it's true that that's what matters the most. And you all are called to a place and to a work, but you're always called to other people, because I mean, even Jesus was the same way. He had a group that he, I always will point to the fact when we're talking and reading through the Bible, that there are people that Jesus would heal or do something with, and then you never see them again.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, well, wait a minute, what was that? Because there was a difference in that, what he did, and then these people that he was trying to train and lead forward, because they would have to be the leaders in the future. Yeah. And then I love the list. One of the things I really like, my wife pointed this out. She says, I know you really like this. There in chapter 13 where Luke goes through these names, and you're like, who is that?
Yeah, we haven't really heard of them
before. Where did that person come from? Yeah, because that's the way it works. It never ends that there are new people and new leaders. And because as Jesus even made that statement, as he said, I'm going to build my church. And so in a sense, you're working at it, you're a part of it, but you're still trusting that he's the one that will reach, call out, and he does.
Well, that's the beauty of what we get to do here, is that we get to help build people up so that they can go and reach people in their community and in their context that you and I would never get to meet.
Right.
That, people go to their jobs or the sporting events or whatever they do in their life that you and I have no context for, that we would never get to be with those people. But we get to help our people disciple and train up so that they can go and be leaders in the context that they're in and influence the world that they have in their context around.
And that's probably one of the parts, I know you might miss this too, that I miss, is that there was a time in my life when I got to be something different because I didn't do a job like this. And so your influence is different. How you're looked to is different. Here, there is an expectation when they find out what you do that you're supposed to be a certain way.
Yeah.
And I have a tendency to push back against that
Yes, you
because
do.
I don't like somebody telling me what I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to do. So I will push back against that. And I love the days. And every once in a while, I still, have those where you get to be just a parent, and you just get to be a neighbor, or you just get to be until they find out what you do, and then they.
Well, I was thinking of like, not in a bad way, but how often I try to delay what I do to people, tell people what I do. And it's not because I'm ashamed at all of being a pastor, but it is because it shifts their way in which they view me.
Right.
Once I use that word, there's just something that happens in their brain of, I can't say this in front of Chris. One of the people at the church, I won't say who because he'd be embarrassed by it, was wanting me to come over to his birthday party. But he was like, I was worried because my family uses certain language that maybe I would not be happy for you to hear. And I go, well, my family uses language too. And it was just this moment of like, no, I can still go into your world. I'm happy to go into your world, but just the funniness of why I do that sometimes of just because perspective does shift in that way.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons why I love, and I do this. I coach my kids' soccer teams and sports teams. And it is because I have these moments where I get to just go be a normal person without this expectation of being a pastor.
Isn't that great?
And I get to influence people in a very different way. And yes, they eventually do learn what I do, but I've already now built this trust in a completely different way that helps break down some walls that maybe would have been there before.
Right. And it still opens doors because my wife knows this. I'll come home sometime and I'll have been out talking with a neighbor and all that, and I will say something like, "It was great because I could tell they were more themselves." So if they're getting comfortable around me to be just who they are and not have to just talk a certain way or because of what I do, because they know what I do, then to me that's great because now we're getting deeper into who they are, how they talk, how they act, and it just opens up better conversations for me. I've always thought so.
You were talking on Sunday on how leadership changes based on the culture and how things that you did maybe at the beginning of your time as a pastor are different now. What are some of the ways that you see us having to approach things different with culture, maybe just as a church, and the way in which we try to reach the people around us?
Boy, that's a big one.
It was a big one.
That's a big one. I mean,
it's a Steve-like question. I'm not going to give any more context either.
Well, I mean, the easiest one is to look around and say that music changes. And it does.
Oh, Mikey's listening to this.
Yeah, and he is. He's listening. And so the music team is in the room right now. So music changes, and that's okay. I don't say this as a saying. I say this seriously. If we are just living on the old music year after year, decade after decade, there's something wrong. Because if it's real, if it's living, if Jesus is who he says he is, then that means he will be influencing a new generation, not to go back to a older style, but content. They will put in their music a different content of what life is about and all, and it will come out in their style, but it will still be the same relationship that we had with God. And I still, I grew up with certain music, so I love old music, but I like the new music. I just like music anyway. And I love to hear the new words, and I love to hear somebody put it in a different way. And it energizes me because I say, hey, I learned something from someone else in this too that I wouldn't have caught any other way.
Well, and you really do see the words changing to reach the current generation that's struggling with whatever problems they're struggling with.
Right.
And so it speaks to a new group of people for a new time. Like general music does that as well, but specifically, when you look at Christian lyrics, they do change, and not in a way that God does not change.
Right.
But the issues that people are struggling with and that are dealing with absolutely change. And we try to reach a group of people for that.
There was a story, again, going back to old stories I read. So this was in a magazine, and it was written by a pastor of a church, And they came upon a time, this was probably 40, 50 years ago, where they realized they needed to make a change. The generation had changed, and they decided not to. And they had a meeting. It wasn't a big church. They had one of their meetings, and they decided not to make certain changes, do certain things. And then 20 years later, 30 years later, he said we had to have another meeting. Everybody had gotten older, including him. And they said, we realized we made a mistake. We need to make those changes. And in the article, he said, I told them too late. And now part of it is he means...
That's a haunting thing to say. Gosh, yeah.
It means too late for him also, that he can't help lead in that because they made a decision not to move forward. And now it was difficult. And I think that that's probably true. I think changes, as culture changes, are easier to make in one sense while they're happening than they are than to try to come back later and make those changes and to jump back, because it's just, you kind of have fallen behind in where things are. And again, not with the message and the message and the gospel itself and who God is, who Jesus is, but we tend as people to tie that to a certain style,
a method,
and culture and what you wear and what you do, and not realize that who he is transcends all that. And it really, if we let it, it will influence it if we don't get in the way. But it's hard not to get in the way because that's not how we see it. We tend to look at it and tie it to, certain things. My dad, one time, grew up in a Presbyterian church. We went to Hilton Head. He owned property there, and we would go to a Presbyterian church there. And during the summer, they would have a guy get up, sit on a stool, play a guitar, little Peter, Paul, and Mary-ish, and whatever. And they liked it, and everybody liked it. And I do remember one time we were driving back, and I was saying, "Oh, hey, so maybe at our home church back in our town, we could do something like that too." And he said, "Well, you can't do that." And I said, "Well, what do you mean you can't do that?" "Well, you can do that on vacation at a beach," and they did, but you can't come back and do that. I was like, "Well, I don't understand. Why can't?" And it was a style that fit more of where I was, my generation. I certainly wasn't a hippie or anything like that, but it related. Yeah, a little bit. The music kind of related more. It just had a different feel than the hymns and the organ and all this stuff. And I grew up singing all that stuff too. But I did realize that didn't connect with a new generation as much as the other connected with the new generation. And I remember Chuck Smith in an interview before he passed away. He's passed away long since, but he was being asked about that, and the fact that someone tried to say the reason he had such impact was because he taught verse by verse. And he said, "Yeah, my story might kind of mess up your idea of that." He said, "So what happened with me was California, loved the beach. He had about 2 years of sermons, and he said when I'd run out, I'd have to go to another church. So he ended up at a certain place where he stayed. He loved the surf on the beach there because he was still young enough to go surfing and all that. And he said, but I knew in 2 years I was going to have to leave, so I had to come up with something else. And so I decided, well, if I just went verse by verse through books of the Bible, I could preach a lot longer." And he said, that was why I made the change, so that I could stay there and surf, and the taxes were low in that county. And I always laugh because, in a sense, what he's doing is he's making the change because of the lifestyle around him. And yet God himself had, a plan. And as I loved one guy who was a musician said, he was a hippie musician. He said, "Look, I was there about 2 years, and if you were around Chuck after that, then you were going to get Bible every Sunday during the week, whatever." And he said, so he had a education, being there, but how he got there was not the way you think. It was not as principled as it was practical for him, but God worked through that. I think that's probably the tough thing with leadership. So is it okay? Can God lead through those types of things and still lead you, and you still be an effective leader? Which is why Sunday, I called it How Change Can Help You to Lead, rather than how leading or your principles can help change, which is how we normally would think about it. I'm not saying abandon your principles. I'm not saying abandon the message. It's the opposite. But God brings change just like he laid down the truth of who he is to us both.
Yeah.
So,
well, and as culture changes, we have, like you said, we have a chance to either move with it and adopt the things that we want to adopt about it, but also to try to reach a new culture and a new people.
yeah.
And I think one of the things that we underplay about why Chuck was effective in that area is, you kind of said it, he was a surfer too. Like he
Yes.
knew the culture and he knew the people and he knew how to speak to them. And it's one of the things that I love about like when I look at our core values, there's two that really resonate with me. And there's one that I'm going to say right now, that we are a church about the next generation.
Right.
And that a lot of our lens is that we're constantly asking the question of, hey, not to forget the past generation, because that's important, but to how are we going to reach these new people with these new problems, with these new contexts for Jesus?
Right.
And I think the more that we go back to that question, the more that we tend to get it right. We're trying to reach these new young families with new struggles and new fears and new identity crises, and how do we reach them in their day and age?
And one of the things I love about our church is the people who are our age, older, I know you young guys and all that stuff too, they do see it that way. And
they're here because of that. Yeah.
Oh man, it's so encouraging, because I remember Eunice Phillips, when she was still alive, she would tell me in private with no one else, she said, yeah, the new music's not my style of music. I still like the old. And she said, but I understand what we're trying to do, and I'm all in.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. And she would get up and try to sing every new song, whatever.
That's awesome.
That she could possibly sing, because she loved the gospel. She understood how much Jesus loved her, and the newer generation was coming, and so she wanted to be a part of that.
Well, even 2 years ago, we were interviewing some of our members that had been here for a long time, because we were celebrating 40 years of Stonebridge.
Right.
And every single one of them, when we asked, what do you hope for the next generation here? And all of them said something along the lines of, we hope that this is still a church that stays true, that they're about the next generation.
Right.
That they're trying, and these are people that are, have been here for 20 years, and that's, their heart still of, we want to be a group of people that don't care about our own preferences, because we want to reach the next generation of Christ followers.
Right.
And I think that's such a cool thing about what it means to be a part of this church.
It's inspiring.
Would you pray for us?
I will. Lord, thank you for this message out of Acts, and just looking at how the church changed, how you led them through the changes, and how through all those changes you were faithful, and you used them just like you did David in his generation and his time, and then he got to go home with you. And we just thank you that you still have a purpose for us, no matter where we are in life, different stages, different places, and you still have plans for the future ahead. And we just love you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.